alligator. I'm a mama, papa coming for you. I'm a space invader.
All right, a little bit of a rough start, but the computer thing is still acting very strange. Welcome to the video about research, about choosing your pitches. I wanted to play that little David Bowie clip, but for some reason, when I start the recording, I don't have the option to share. I don't have any tools. All I have is live on YouTube. It's very peculiar. This is not how it was last term. Anyway, welcome. Thank you for joining me. I want to talk to you for a few minutes, and I want to keep this video relatively short to talk to you about generating the pitch for your research project and doing some much needed brainstorming to get ready to embark on your project. So at the risk of boring you horribly, I'm going to actually share my notes, which will be included with this video. And kind of walk through them, and then back and forth. Maybe we'll do a little internet as well. So here we go. I'll make myself bigger. So what is a pitch? So, you know, as I said in the live classes, a pitch is very much like some creators of a television show that go to television producers and present ideas to say, here's this idea we have. We think it could be a good TV show, you know, and they have a pitch. They describe the idea. They have, you know, some details about how it will work. They have maybe some details about who might be in it or who might work on it, and that sort of thing. So very much in the same vein, you're pitching ideas for a research project as if they were really to be published. You know, just imagine you're pitching to an editorial board, and you're saying, you know, here's my idea, and you have a description of it, and then you have some initial exploration of source materials to see if it's going to be viable for a project. All right. It's not a good day unless I have a Zoom crash. So I'm back from my Zoom crash. Thank you for sticking with me. Let's see if this stays in one file or becomes two files. That'll be a really important question. So you're pitching ideas is what I was talking about when I had the crash. And then they're going to get vetted by the editorial board, which is your classmates, but also me. And I'm going to go through each and every one and give you my opinions on, you know, this idea has potential, this idea I'm dubious about it, and this idea I'm vetoing out of hand for this reason. You know, I'll always give you a reason. I won't just, you know, do it, and I won't take that power lightly. I'll only veto ideas for really good reasons. Mainly because I think pursuit of them will be bad for you in terms of coming up with a good project. There's only, as I said, really one idea that I don't want to read about. Other than that, I'm pretty open, but there's some ideas that I just don't think make for good projects. So we start with the question of the form, what does or what can, I decided to add that, a thing teach us about a thing? And of course, the intention of this project is to prompt you to learn about new things. So what we really want you to fill these blanks with is at least one thing that's brand new to you, or relatively new to you, or that you don't know very much about at all, or nothing about really. But getting students to do that is very difficult. You know, I resisted it even when I was a student. So if just hearing about it yourself makes you resist it, I'm with you. I totally understand that. Of course, as I'll explain, we want you to have buy-in, right? You know, but what we don't want is you recycling stuff you already did. Even though, as I explained in class, I did that too. And then, you know, I could randomize this. I could set this up in such a way that you're pulling ideas out of a hat at random, and then have to pursue what you end up getting. but a lot of students will feel stuck with those ideas, and so you know, that's not going to make for a good project. So I really want you to have ownership of creating this question, which is the starting point for your project. So what does or what can a thing teach us about another thing? And so I want to explain to you that this is not the end goal. A good research question is not the end goal. A good question is merely a starting point to begin research and to start to shape the clay. The end result could be very different than the starting place. The question is not the thesis. In fact, I probably want to separate this and make it bigger, which I didn't do initially. The question is not the thesis. And in fact, as I mentioned before, I'm going to insist that you make a thesis that doesn't contain any form of the word teach. So that ultimately you're going to have to get away from that idea, but keep the spirit of the idea. And really, you'll probably just come up with synonyms for teach, but that's okay. So brainstorming. We want to foment your brains to action and imagination, come up with good ideas, to pitch them, 5 of them, to the discussion, and settle on one to begin the research process, to investigate and determine if it will yield a good project. So how do we get there? Well, the first thing is your passion and interest. It all begins with that. You know, if you're not interested in the idea, then you know, you're not going to take ownership of it. You're not going to feel like working on it. So it's very important that you pick ideas that you're very interested in. I'm hoping that you can come up with 5 ideas that you're interested in, so that whichever one you end up settling on, you know, like what if the worst case scenario were to happen and all but one of them is vetoed? Of course, it's even more worst case scenarios that all 5 are vetoed. But usually I don't veto ideas out of hand, you know, unless I have a really strong reason. Instead, I'll just say, in the form you have it, you can't really start, but we could transform that. And I'm going to talk about that here in a minute. But I'm hoping that you're interested in enough things that you can generate enough ideas that you're willing to pursue with hard work and interest and lots of time, because this class takes lots of time in devotion to what we're going to do. So then the next thing in coming up with a really good question is really good contrast. That ultimately we really want a strong contrast between the two things. So what does rain teach us about water should be funny to you, because it has no contrast at all. Or, you know, we can make it even sillier. You know, what does rain teach us about thunderstorms? Or what does rain teach us about rainstorms? Or, you know, it's you know, just it's redundant and lame. Likewise, what does brain surgery teach us about surgery? Or what does brain surgery teach us about medical science? Are equally lacking in contrast. What does brain surgery teach us about cognitive organization theory might be better. But I would have to play around with that. And that's the whole point of the pitch. You know, you settle on a potentially good question, then you could start to explore it a little bit, get some information, do a little bit of reading, and determine whether or not there's some merit there that's going to turn into a good project. But we want that jump. We want that intersection. We want that contrast. And so what does Taoism teach us about quantum physics, which I'm also going to make bigger because it's going to be my go-to example. That has great contrast. And it's a book, you know, so I have a core source and I have a bibliography of additional sources in the back of the book. So, you know, ideas like that, where there's a core book source, are okay. They're good. There is some danger of overusing the source, of overusing the book source. You know, so you really have to determine whether there's additional sources for the idea. Of course, you know, you're going deep into Taoism and you're going deep into quantum physics. So there's lots of sources for those things. So adherence to this book isn't isn't as big a problem, but we don't want students that just rewrite a book. I've had that, and they don't turn into good projects because, you might list 15 sources, but you're primarily using one source over and over and over. And yeah, that's not research. So we have to be wary of that idea. And yet this is a really great idea. That's why it's a book. So no tautology. What does rain teach us about water is a tautology. It's basically a repetition. Rain and water are the same thing. And that's no good for a project. The idea is the jump between the things in terms of how one thing applies to another, how one thing informs another. But what can we do with these ideas? Same with the brain surgery and the surgery thing. But what can we do with these ideas? Excuse me. There's nuggets there. What ideas can we come up with about rain? What ideas can we generate about water, like access to water, shortage of water, value of water, etc.? We're on the right track. But a question like what does rain teach us about climate change is still not very good, and I'll explain why in the next thing that we're looking for, which is the just one thing idea. In the pitch, I call this legs. It's the idea of breadth and depth to the subject that you've chosen. Ideas can be very one note. This idea, what does rain teach us about climate change, is not very complex. It's probably just one article. For example, what can the connection between a mother and a child teach us about how the child develops is the same kind of a thing. It's basically probably all found in just one article, which again gets us to the idea of the core source, but only if the idea has room to expand. And this is where this idea is very different than the Taoism quantum physics idea. The Taoism quantum physics idea has the option to expand and expand and expand. There's lots and lots of stuff there because there's even more complexity about quantum physics and tons and tons and tons of things that have been written about it compared to Tao Te Ching, and lots of things have been written about that. And there's lots of side projects, there's lots of related texts. And so an idea like this is just too specific. It's really just one idea, because obviously the writer wants to write about the bond between a mother and a child and child development. So child development is the core concept. So we can pull this idea apart a little bit, and maybe we can get to a better idea, right? We can research child development. There's a lot of stuff to research there. So there's some viability to that idea. And some of it speaks to the importance of a bond and a relationship with a parent, though not necessarily with a mother, though there's a lot of research about the bond specifically between a child and a mother as opposed to, another parent. And then, of course, that gets us into questions of same-sex parents, and those sorts of things, so there's some controversy there, but it still needs work, so one of the things that you might do is that you might do some Google searching and a quick so I need a page with Google. And I'm going to keep coming back and forth here, probably. So I'm going to type child development and then right away I get this Child Development and Rehabilitation Center, which is the name of a place nearby, but child development in video games, child development education, child development and learning, child development family studies. So family dynamics, that has a little bit more, or what does family dynamics teach us about child development? That has a little bit more of a possibility. child development education again, child development and technology, child development and parenting. But parenting is included in family studies or family dynamics. And so, that's repetitive with that. But child development and family studies or family dynamics, that has possibility. Then I might go and open the Wikipedia page for child development and see what I find there. Now I could just Google child development, but I often just go straight to Wikipedia and use its search function. Child development. And I got child development stages in India, perspectives in Africa, research, so I have many more avenues to explore with just that idea. But as I load up child development, I'm going to start to look through here and see, and of course the table of contents in Wikipedia is often a really good thing to get my mind, so what do we care about with child development, because it might be difficult to write about all these things. May we just care about cognitive intellectual development or language and communication skills? And so we see that there's a lot of things here, but those things stand out as possible directions. We also see some of the key people that have studied it, Piaget, Erik Erikson. So you probably want to look at that, see what kinds of things that they've said and written about, and that may be really helpful to us in deciding where to go with that idea. The idea is to get a good starting place for your idea, where you have some direction already. So you also might want to try to see what TED Talks there are about child development. You also might want to just take a quick peek in Google Scholar, before you go to the library, which is going to be a very, a step we're going to get to very soon, because you're going to need many scholarly sources. So with something like child development, I can tell you right away, without even you looking, that there's, whole journals dedicated to child development, many of them. So you have no trouble finding scholarly sources about child development and any part of child development. So let's recap a little bit. We're avoiding tautology. We're avoiding OneNote ideas that are basically just one article. Now, one that is one book, maybe, but we want to be careful about that. We're also looking for contrast, and we want to speak to your passions. So what else? We want unique and fresh ideas. We want ideas to be unique and distinctive, as unlike other projects as possible. Often I tell students to list 20 ideas that first come to the mind, and then cross those ideas out and list 20 new ideas, because that second list is going to be the more interesting list. And it almost always works that way. Once you get out all of the ideas, many of which are maybe not that interesting, not to say that you don't come up with interesting ideas, because you do, but we all have the initial easy answers. Then the next, when we start to really think about it, after we've dismissed a lot of those easy answers, we might get some really good ideas. Does your idea have project potential? Not just potential, but the potential for a project. Does the question have the makings of at least one, though better if there are many arguments implicit in that idea that you can explore? For instance, what can ambient music teach us about human psychology? That would qualify. There's a lot of different arguments that I could make about that, probably, and I would need to explore. What does role-playing games teach us about politics? This also has a really good possibility, but both the ideas of politics and human psychologies are huge abstractions. So that's why I keep telling you, this is just the starting point. That's okay for a starting point, but you're going to have to develop those ideas and get specific about what about politics or what about human psychology that we're going to talk about. But it's a good starting point, and there's possibilities for a lot of exploration. And one of your first steps should always be, has somebody else already written about it? And I did the Google search. I'm not going to go share and take our time with that, but the answer is yes. I found there were multiple articles. I at least saw 4 or 5 right from the quick Google search. So then beyond that, so if we find some initial materials, is the idea complex? Because ultimately you need at least 15 pages and at least 15 sources, so if you have an idea that's too restricted, even the bond between a mother and a child and child development might be too restricted if we're just focused on the bond between the mother and the child. I don't know, I'd have to research it, but we'll come back to it. I want to say a few things about this at the end, and I'm over halfway done. Is the idea, excuse me, is the idea achievable? You can have an idea that's too complex. What do vampire stories tell us about rape fantasy and rape culture is very complex. It's a whole book. It's more than a project if we're going to be comprehensive. But you don't necessarily have to be comprehensive, so you could focus that a little bit. But then the other problem is focusing it too much. What do vampire stories in anime in the last 10 years tell us about rape fantasy? That might be too focused. There might not be any materials about that whatsoever. And you're going to have some materials that speak to your idea. Now, certainly we could find a lot of information about rape fantasy and rape culture. We could find maybe some information about the history of depiction of women and vampires in anime. But within the last 10 years, I don't know. So let's look at how we would iterate these ideas. And then I want to flip to something that's not in my notes, but that I wanted to talk about. So to see how we would progress a question. So starting with what can Taoism teach us about Chinese philosophy is too much of a tautology. It's too much of a repetition. What can Tao Te Ching teach us about Chinese culture? That's a little better, but it might not, it doesn't really have the contrast yet. What can Taoism teach us about spirituality and inner alchemy? Now that is probably pretty good enough to go. And then what does Taoism teach us about quantum physics is my go-to example, right? So I'm going to come back to talk about this contrast a little bit after I show you some things over in these other notes, which I want to talk about. So there's different ways to think about the ideas that you might come up with. One is how ideas apply or intersect with other ideas. Taoism is being applied to quantum physics. The COVID-19 situation is in a sense being applied to the education system. Native American creation myths is being used to interpret and understand Gaia theory. Other times, it's an idea that's part of the initial idea, but it's complex enough that it's going to probably yield a good project. What do beehives teach us about organizational efficiency? Beehives are an example of organizational efficiency. So in a sense, this is a tautology, but it's not a bad one because we can do so much with organizational efficiency. We can apply that to so many things that this has potential. What does deep ecology teach us about a modern way of life? Well, modern way of life is pretty vague, but deep ecology is interesting. So I would tentatively approve that probably. But as I'd said before, and I hope if I reuse this video, I've said this before, ongoing, is that this idea really would work great with literary interpretation, where you take some stuff to read. Beat poets, science fiction, apocalyptic stories, Victorian literature, modern poetry, slam poetry, the romantic, the transcendental romantics, the writings of Henry David Thoreau, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on and on. The Shakespearean sonnets, interpreting things will work really great for this idea. And that's where I got my vampire stories, rape fantasy and rape culture. That's out there. It exists. It's been written about. So we want to get this contrast. So let's take some ideas, like homophobia, the brain music, And one thing you could do is start with something like, say, the brain or music, and just do a bunch of just a bunch of questions, as many as you can think of. The brain in this thing, the brain in this thing, and on and on and on. The brain, some of them are going to be lame, probably. The brain in psychology, the brain in medicine, but the brain in food, the brain in the environment, like I could, play around, right? So for instance, what can listening to music teach us about sound waves is kind of one note. That's kind of one article. That's not very interesting. What can the brain music teach us about the brain is a little better. Still, I'm dubious about it, but it's a little better. What can the mathematics of music teach us about brain waves? That seems more specific, seems more interesting. I'm not as dubious about it. However, is it one note? I mean, like even if I approve an idea, you need to explore and see if there's going to be enough here for a project. Remember, we're talking about project potential. So maybe it's more interesting to get that contrast better. What does music teach us about politics? What does music history teach us about American history? What does music culture teach us about human psychology? Those all have more contrast and they have more potential for the project. They have more legs. Try these with and pairs in Google. I did the music and politics, music in the brain, and both of them came up as soon as I typed music and in the Google search. But then, try some ones that seem kind of crazy, and maybe you'll hit on something that really interests you. Like I came up with this. What does our relationship with food teach us about our relationship with music? I kind of like that. It's got interesting contrast. It's both about relationships that we have with things, and we as humans, I guess, is we could maybe change that to Americans if we wanted to do that and keep it focused. So try lots of these combinations. Try lots of these combinations to see what you come up with. I could keep brainstorming and brainstorming with you, but I want to keep this video relatively short. So in the end, the pitch is just really the place to start. Once you settle on an idea, then you explore to see if it has legs, if it has research and content potential, to see if and how it may need to transform. What does music teach us about politics? Is interesting, but it's vague in one note, but it does have potential. Your job is to find the potential. Once you have approved subjects and choose one to explore, you have a week to commit to this idea. Can you find a lot of sources? Are there core sources? At least one. For instance, here's another core source I might use. It's a book about Aikido and philosophy of peace. So what does Aikido teach us about peace or being peaceful? Is pretty much explaining what the thing explains, but it has potential. So sometimes finding core sources, finding interesting books, finding interesting articles, as long as then you can look and see if you can find more, might be good places to start. But again, as I warned you, having a book as a core source is bad if you just try to rewrite the book in a shorter form. That's not going to work. So you're still going to transform and shape this idea. Even beyond your week, you have a week to be like, yes, this is an idea. I'm going to pursue this idea. We just want to make sure you don't have to select a completely different idea, because that lost time is time you're never going to get back. This course is time intensive. There's a lot of work to do. And so we want to make sure that your idea is relatively viable before you go and do a lot of work on it, that you more or less have to repeat if you change to a completely different idea, rather than just shifting this idea, changing this idea. So those are the things to think about. I look forward to your pitches. We're going to go through all of them. We're going to go through them in class, where I'm going to go through them. And so thank you for taking the time to pay attention to this video. I'm thrilled to be here with you. See, I still got live on YouTube. I'm out, but I can't play an outro unless I'm sharing a screen. It's very peculiar. See, if I go back, I just share iTunes. If I go back to sharing iTunes, then I share computer sound and
I'm an alligator.
understand both. Thanks for paying
I'm a
attention.
mama, papa coming for you. I'm a space invader. I'll be a rock and rollin' bitch for you.